Sarah Martinez stood at the balcony of her modest apartment, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in hues of gold and pink. At 20 years old, she felt like her life was about to change, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the romance novels she devoured late at night, or maybe the stories her grandmother used to tell her about destiny, finding you when you least expect it. Working as a junior event coordinator at one of the city's most prestigious hotels wasn't exactly her dream job, but it paid the bills and occasionally allowed her to glimpse into a world of luxury she could only imagine. Little did she know that today would be the day her life would take an unexpected turn. The Grand Plaza Hotel was hosting its annual International Business Summit, and Sarah was tasked with ensuring everything ran smoothly. As she hurried through the marble-floored lobby, checking last-minute details on her tablet, she quite literally ran into destiny. Rounding a corner, she collided with a tall, impeccably dressed man who managed to catch her before she fell. "I'm so sorry, sir. I wasn't looking where I was going," Sarah apologized, straightening her blazer. Looking up, she found herself staring into the most captivating dark eyes she had ever seen. "The fault is entirely mine," he replied with a slight accent that she couldn't quite place. "I was distracted by the beautiful architecture." His smile was warm and genuine, making Sarah's heart skip a beat. "I'm Karim Al-Rahman," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Sarah Martinez," she managed to reply, taking his offered hand. "Are you here for the summit?" "Indeed. I represent several international development projects." His modesty was charming, but Sarah would later learn that Karim wasn't just representing projects, he owned them. As the heir to one of the largest development companies in the Middle East, his net worth was in the billions. Over the next few weeks, Karim found reasons to extend his stay in the city. Each time he requested changes to his suite, he specifically asked for Sarah to handle them. Their professional interactions gradually evolved into coffee breaks, then dinners, and finally moonlit walks through the city park. Karim was unlike anyone Sarah had ever met. He spoke passionately about architecture, art, and his vision for sustainable cities of the future. He listened intently when she shared her dreams of traveling the world and making a difference in people's lives. With him, she felt seen and understood in a way she never had before. "My country has some of the most beautiful architecture in the world," he told her one evening as they sat in his private suite, watching the city lights twinkle below. "I would love to show it to you someday." Sarah's heart raced at the possibility. "I've always wanted to travel," she admitted, "but I've never even left the country." "Then let me be your guide," Karim said, taking her hand. "Come with me. I can show you wonders you've only dreamed of." The invitation seemed too good to be true. Her friends and family expressed concern about the whirlwind romance, but Sarah was caught up in the fairy tale. Karim's world was like something out of 1,001 Nights, private jets, exotic locations, and promises of a love that would transcend cultural boundaries. Within months, Sarah found herself boarding Karim's private jet, bound for his homeland. The opulence of his world both thrilled and intimidated her. His family's palace was more magnificent than any building she had ever seen, with fountains, gardens, and rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly. Karim's family welcomed her with elaborate ceremonies and gifts that took her breath away. His mother, though reserved, presented her with traditional jewelry that had been in their family for generations. "Welcome to our family," she said, but there was something in her eyes that Sarah couldn't quite read. Was it concern? The wedding plans moved forward at a dizzying pace. Sarah was swept up in a whirlwind of designers, planners, and cultural advisors who taught her the intricate customs she would need to observe as Karim's wife. Everything seemed perfect, perhaps too perfect. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her suite in the palace, watching the sun set over the desert, Sarah felt a slight tremor of uncertainty. The city spread out before her was beautiful, but somehow foreign and mysterious. Karim appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, kissing her shoulder. "Just trying to take it all in," she replied, leaning back against him. "Sometimes it feels like a dream." "The dream is only beginning," he promised, turning her to face him. "Soon you'll be my wife, and all of this will be yours too." Sarah smiled, pushing away the small voice in her head that whispered caution. After all, isn't this what she had always dreamed of, eh? Great love, adventure, and a life that seemed lifted from the pages of a fairy tale. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, she chose to believe in the promise of happily ever after. The wedding was a spectacle that surpassed anything Sarah could have imagined. The palace gardens were transformed into an enchanted oasis, with thousands of twinkling lights suspended between palm trees and rose petals carpeting every pathway. As she walked down the aisle in a gown that cost more than her old apartment building, Sarah felt like she had stepped into a modern fairy tale. The celebration lasted for 3 days, with guests flying in from around the world. Sarah's family, though somewhat overwhelmed by the grandeur, seemed to have finally accepted that their daughter had indeed married into one of the wealthiest families in the Middle East. Her mother's initial concerns about the rapid courtship appeared to fade in the face of such obvious prosperity and Karim's evident devotion. The honeymoon was a whirlwind tour of private islands and exclusive resorts, each destination more luxurious than the last. Karim showered her with gifts, diamonds, designer clothes, and priceless artifacts. Yet among all this opulence, Sarah found herself missing the simple pleasure of calling her friends or posting photos on social media. "My love," Karim said, one evening as they lounged on their private beach, "I think it would be best if you deleted your social media accounts." His tone was gentle, but Sarah detected something different in his voice, a hint of steel beneath the velvet. "Delete them? Why?" she asked, sitting up on her lounger. "I've barely posted anything since the wedding." "As my wife, you have a certain position to maintain. Social media can be problematic. There are people who might try to use information about our family improperly." He reached over to stroke her cheek. "It's for our protection, Habibi. Trust me." The request seemed reasonable when he explained it that way, and Sarah reluctantly agreed. After all, she rationalized, she was part of a prominent family now. Their privacy and security were important. Still, as she deleted each account, she felt a small piece of her old life slipping away. Upon returning to their palace after the honeymoon, Sarah noticed other subtle changes. Her colorful wardrobe was gradually replaced with more appropriate attire. Her once bright dresses were exchanged for elegant but conservative designer pieces in muted tones. When she questioned this, Karim explained that as his wife, she needed to dress in a manner that commanded respect. "But I liked my old clothes," Sarah protested mildly one morning as she stared at her transformed closet. "And I like seeing you look like the princess you are," Karim replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "When people look at you, they should see my queen, not a casual Western girl." His words were loving, but something in them made Sarah's spine stiffen slightly. The days fell into a routine of luxury and privilege. Sarah had a team of staff at her disposal, maids, cooks, drivers, and personal assistants. Yet she found herself missing the independence of her old life. Simple things like driving herself to a coffee shop or meeting friends for lunch became complicated affairs requiring security details and advanced planning. Her phone calls home became less frequent, partly because of the time difference, but also because she felt increasingly disconnected from her old world. How could she explain to her best friend that she wasn't allowed to meet her for coffee during her visit to the country without proper security clearance? How could she tell her mother that her new husband preferred she not leave the palace grounds? Without his knowledge, one afternoon, Sarah decided to surprise Karim at his office. She dressed carefully in one of her new approved outfits and asked the driver to take her to his building. When she arrived, however, she was politely but firmly turned away by security. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Al-Rahman, but we have strict instructions about unscheduled visits," the guard explained apologetically. That evening, Karim returned home later than usual. His face was carefully composed, but Sarah could sense his displeasure. "My love," he began, his voice controlled, "why did you try to come to my office today?" "I wanted to surprise you," Sarah replied, suddenly feeling foolish. "I thought we could have lunch together." "Surprises can be dangerous in our position," he explained, taking her hands in his. There are protocols in place for a reason. Promise me you won't do anything like that again without checking with me first." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears she didn't quite understand. Karim pulled her into an embrace, kissing her forehead. "Don't cry, Habibi. Everything I do is to protect you. This world is different from what you're used to. There are expectations, traditions, rules. That must be followed." He lifted her chin with one finger. "But look at everything you have in return. You're the most envied woman in the country." Later that night, as she lay awake in their enormous bed, Sarah stared at the intricate patterns on the ceiling. The silk sheets felt cool against her skin, and the distant sound of fountains echoed through the palace grounds. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: wealth, luxury, a handsome and powerful husband who claimed to adore her. So why did she feel this growing knot of unease in her stomach? Why did she find herself missing the simple freedom of walking down a street alone, of making spontaneous plans, of sharing her life with friends and family without filters and restrictions? As if sensing her thoughts, Karim stirred beside her. "What's keeping you awake, my love?" he murmured, pulling her closer. "Just thinking about how much my life has changed," she whispered back. "All changes take adjustment," he replied, his voice heavy with sleep. "But I promise you, this is the life you were meant to have. You belong here with me." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to believe his words. After all, isn't this what fairy tales were made of? But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice wondered if fairy tales were supposed to feel quite so much like beautiful prisons. The news of Sarah's pregnancy came during her 6th month of marriage. She sat in the marble bathroom of their palace suite, staring at the positive test with mixed emotions. Joy bubbled up inside her, but it was tempered by an underlying anxiety she couldn't quite name. When she told Karim, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around their bedroom with genuine delight. "This is wonderful news, Habibi. Our family will be so pleased." His eyes sparkled with excitement as he placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach. The pregnancy transformed Sarah's already restricted world even further. Karim hired the country's top medical team, who prescribed a strict regimen of rest and carefully monitored activities. Her diet was meticulously planned, her exercise routine supervised, and her daily schedule restructured around the baby's optimal development. "You must rest more," Karim insisted, when she suggested continuing her charity work with local women's organizations, the one activity that had given her a sense of purpose. "The baby must be your priority now." Sarah found herself confined to specific areas of the palace, with staff monitoring her every move, under the guise of ensuring her well-being. Her mother's request to visit and help during the pregnancy was politely but firmly deflected by Karim. "My mother will guide you through this," he explained. "She knows our customs, our traditions. It's better this way." His mother, though not unkind, was a formidable presence who supervised Sarah's pregnancy with rigid adherence to local traditions. Some of these customs felt alien and restrictive to Sarah, but any attempt to question them was met with stern disapproval. "You carry the next generation of our family," her mother-in-law reminded her frequently. "Everything must be done properly." As her body changed, Sarah spent hours in the palace gardens, one of the few places she was still allowed to visit freely. The high walls surrounding the elaborate grounds felt more oppressive with each passing day. She found herself talking to the flowers, desperate for some form of uninhibited expression. One afternoon, she noticed a new gardener tending to the roses. Unlike the other staff who barely made eye contact with her, this older man offered a gentle smile. Over the following weeks, he became a quiet presence in her daily walks. He never spoke much, but his kind eyes reminded her of her own grandfather. During one of her walks, Sarah stumbled slightly, and the gardener rushed to steady her. As he helped her regain her balance, he pressed something into her hand, a small piece of paper. She quickly slipped it into her pocket, heart pounding. Later, alone in her bathroom, she unfolded the paper to find a phone number scrawled in neat handwriting. Beneath it were the words, "If you need help." Her hands trembled as she memorized the number before flushing the paper down the toilet. That night, Karim was unusually agitated during dinner. "I've dismissed the new gardener," he announced casually. He wasn't working out. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. Why, he seemed to be doing a good job with the roses. Karim's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something cold and hard in them. "The roses aren't your concern, Habibi. Besides, I don't like the way he looked at you." The implicit threat in his voice made Sarah's blood run cold. She forced herself to nod and return to her meal, but the food had lost all taste. As her pregnancy progressed, Sarah's world shrank even further. Security was increased for her protection. Her phone calls were now monitored for her safety. Even her medical appointments were attended by Karim's security team. The birth of their son, Adam, brought momentary joy and a brief respite from the suffocating control. Holding her baby for the first time, Sarah felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. But even this pure moment was interrupted by doctors, nurses, and family members whisking the baby away for various traditional ceremonies. "Don't worry," Karim assured her. "The nurses will take care of everything, you just rest." But Sarah didn't want to rest. She wanted to hold her baby, to feed him herself, to be his mother. Instead, she found herself following a rigid schedule of supervised visits to the nursery, where a team of nannies handled most of the care. "This is how it's done in our family," her mother-in-law explained firmly when Sarah protested. "The heir must be raised properly from the beginning." Late at night, when the palace was quiet, Sarah would sneak to the nursery. In these stolen moments, she would hold her son close, singing soft lullabies in English, her native language now forbidden in the palace. She told him stories about her childhood, about freedom, about a world beyond these gilded walls. During one of these secret visits, she heard footsteps approaching. Quickly placing Adam back in his crib, she barely made it back to her room before the door opened. Karim stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the hallway light. "Why aren't you sleeping, Habibi?" His voice was gentle, but Sarah had learned to hear the steel beneath the softness. "I was just getting some water," she lied, her heart racing. He crossed the room and cupped her face in his hands. "You need your rest. Tomorrow I'll have someone bring water to your room at night." His kiss on her forehead felt like a warning. As she lay in bed, listening to Karim's steady breathing beside her, Sarah realized with growing clarity that her fairy tale had become a nightmare. Her son's birth, rather than bringing the joy and fulfillment she had dreamed of, had only tightened the invisible chains around her. The years passed like pages turning in a book Sarah wasn't allowed to read. Adam grew from a baby into a curious toddler, and soon she was pregnant again. The second pregnancy was even more restricted than the first, with Karim insisting she remain in her private wing of the palace for her safety. Her second son, Malik, was born under the same rigid protocols as his brother. But this time, Sarah was prepared. She had learned to navigate the labyrinth of rules and expectations, finding small ways to maintain her connection with her children despite the army of nannies and supervisors. She created a secret game with her sons, teaching them English through whispered stories and songs when they were alone. To the rest of the household, she appeared to have accepted her role as the perfectly obedient wife, but in these precious moments with her children, she kept her true self alive. "Mama, tell us about the snow again," Adam would beg during their supervised playtime. At 5 years old, he was already showing signs of his father's intelligence and his mother's curiosity. "Snow is like tiny stars falling from the sky," she would say in English, careful to switch back to Arabic when servants passed by. "It covers everything in white, making the world look magical." Malik, just 2, would clap his hands in delight at these stories, too young to understand the risk his mother took in sharing them. The official family language was Arabic, and Karim had made it clear that the children were to be raised in their cultural traditions without Western influences. One afternoon, during a rare moment when Sarah was allowed to take the children to the palace gardens under the watchful eyes of their security detail, she noticed Adam staring intently at a bird flying freely above the high walls. "Can we go outside the palace someday, Mama?" he asked innocently. "Like the bird?" Before Sarah could respond, one of the guards stepped forward. "Young master, Your father has arranged for everything you need within the palace grounds. There's no reason to leave. That evening, Karim called Sarah to his study, a rare occurrence that immediately set her nerves on edge. He sat behind his massive desk, looking more like a king on his throne than a husband. "The guards tell me Adam was asking about leaving the palace today," he said without preamble. "I'm concerned about the ideas you're putting in our children's heads, Habibi." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. "He's just curious, Karim. All children are." "Curiosity must be properly directed," he replied, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. "From now on, the children's activities will be more structured. I've hired additional tutors to ensure they receive the proper education befitting their position." "They're just babies," Sarah protested, forgetting herself for a moment. "They need time to play, to imagine." Karim's hand slammed down on the desk, making her jump. "They are my sons and heirs to everything I've built. They will be raised as I see fit." His voice softened dangerously. "Unless you'd prefer different arrangements for your time with them?" The threat was clear. Sarah quickly lowered her eyes, adopting the submissive posture she had learned to perfect. "Of course not, my love. You know what's best for our family." That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah's mind raced with memories of the phone number the gardener had given her years ago. She had memorized it, repeating it silently to herself each night like a prayer, though she had never dared to use it. But now, watching her children's spirits being slowly crushed under the same golden chains that bound her, she felt something shift inside her. The next morning, during her carefully monitored breakfast with the children, she noticed something different about Adam. He sat straighter, spoke less, and watched the guards with a new awareness in his young eyes. When he caught her looking at him, he gave her a slight nod, so much like his father's that it made her heart ache. But it was Malik who truly frightened her. During their afternoon play session, he began crying when she tried to speak to him in English. "No, Mama," he said, pushing away from her. "Papa says it's bad words." Sarah felt as if she'd been struck. "Who told you that, Habibi?" "My new teacher. She says we must only speak proper words." His lower lip trembled. "I don't want to be bad, Mama." Fighting back tears, Sarah pulled him close. "You're not bad, my love. You could never be bad." Over his head, she saw Adam watching them with an unreadable expression. Later that day, as she walked through the palace corridors, Sarah caught her reflection in one of the countless ornate mirrors. The woman staring back at her was beautifully dressed, perfectly groomed, and completely hollow-eyed. She barely recognized herself anymore. A movement in the mirror caught her attention. One of the new maids was watching her with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. Their eyes met for a brief moment before the maid quickly looked away and hurried past. But in that instant, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a connection with another human being who might understand her situation. That night, as she sang her children to sleep under the pretense of traditional lullabies, she made a decision. The phone number she had memorized years ago stopped being just a sequence of digits and became a lifeline. She couldn't let her children grow up in this beautiful prison, losing themselves piece by piece as she had. Sarah's opportunity came during one of Karim's extended business trips. With him away, the security protocols, while still strict, became slightly more relaxed. The guards were less vigilant, the staff less watchful, and she found brief moments when she wasn't under constant surveillance. During one such moment, she discovered an old cell phone forgotten in one of the palace's countless storage rooms. Her hands trembled as she held it, remembering the number she had memorized years ago. The phone was outdated but still functional. She quickly hid it in a loose panel behind her vanity mirror, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. That evening, as she sat with her children during their strictly scheduled dinner time, she noticed how Adam had started to mimic his father's mannerisms. At 7 years old, he was already learning to command the staff with an air of authority that broke her heart. "Malik, sit up straight," Adam instructed his younger brother. "Father says we must always show proper posture." Malik, now 4, immediately straightened his spine, his little face serious. "Like this, brother." Sarah watched the interaction with a growing sense of urgency. Her children were being molded into perfect replicas of their father's world, their natural joy and curiosity slowly being replaced by rigid rules and expectations. That night, after ensuring the children were asleep and the night staff had completed their rounds, Sarah retrieved the hidden phone. In her bathroom, with the shower running to mask any sound, she finally dialed the number she had carried in her memory for so long. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered in Arabic. "Hello." Sarah's voice caught in her throat. After a moment she managed to whisper, "The gardener, he gave me this number years ago." There was a pause, then the woman switched to English. "Yes, I remember. We've been waiting for your call. Are you safe to talk?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she explained her situation in hushed tones. The woman listened patiently, asking occasional questions about security protocols and daily routines. "Listen carefully," the woman finally said. "I'm a lawyer with an international women's rights organization. We can help you, but you must understand, leaving with the children will be nearly impossible under local laws." Sarah felt her heart constrict. "What do you mean?" "In this country, children legally belong to their father's family. Even if you managed to leave, they would use every resource to bring the children back. You would never see them again." The reality of her situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had to choose between staying in her golden cage with her children or fighting for freedom alone. "There might be another way," the lawyer continued carefully. "We could help you build a case for shared custody through international courts. It would take time, but—" A noise in the hallway made Sarah freeze. "Someone's coming," she whispered, quickly ending the call and hiding the phone. Moments later, there was a knock at her door. "Mrs. Al-Rahman, is everything all right? We heard water running for quite a while." "I'm fine," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Just enjoying a long shower." The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and internal conflict. Sarah watched her children with new eyes, noticing every sign of their father's influence taking root. During their daily language lessons, she saw how Malik struggled to express himself naturally, constantly looking to his tutors for approval before speaking. Adam, on the other hand, was thriving under the strict regime. He had started correcting Malik's improper behavior and reporting any infractions to his tutors. Yet sometimes, when they were alone, Sarah caught glimpses of the curious, loving boy beneath the formal exterior. One afternoon, during their supervised playtime in the garden, Adam found a small bird that had fallen from its nest. Instead of calling the guards as his training dictated, he gently picked it up, hiding it from view. "Mama," he whispered in English, reverting to their secret language, "can we help it?" For a brief moment, Sarah saw her real son, compassionate, gentle and still capable of defying the rigid rules that surrounded them. Together they managed to return the bird to its nest while the guards were distracted. That evening, as she watched her children sleep, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't abandon them to this life of gilded constraints. There had to be another way to save not just herself, but her children's spirits as well. She waited until the palace was quiet before retrieving the phone again. This time, when she called the lawyer, her voice was steady with determination. "I need to know everything about international custody laws," she said firmly, "and I need to understand exactly what I'm up against." "It won't be easy," the lawyer warned. "The Al-Rahman family has enormous influence." "I know," Sarah replied, watching her children's peaceful faces in the moonlight. "But my children deserve a chance at real freedom, even if it takes years to achieve it. Tell me what I need to do." As she ended the call, Sarah heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Quickly hiding the phone, she moved to her children's bedside, pretending to adjust their blankets. The footsteps paused outside the door, then continued down the corridor. Sarah released the breath she'd been holding, knowing she had just taken the first step on a dangerous path. But looking at her sleeping children, she felt a strength she thought she had lost years ago. The fairy tale prison had not completely broken her spirit after all. Over the next few months, Sarah methodically documented everything. Using the hidden phone, she photographed official documents when she could find them, recorded conversations, and kept detailed notes of the daily restrictions placed on her and the children. Each piece of evidence was immediately sent to her lawyer through a secure app, then deleted from the phone. The lawyer, whose name she learned was Amara, had become her lifeline to the outside world. During their brief, carefully timed conversations, she learned about international custody laws and the complexities of her situation. The key, Amara explained during one of their calls, is building a case that proves the children's best interests aren't being served by their current situation. We need evidence of educational restrictions, emotional manipulation, anything that shows they're being denied basic freedoms. Sarah found an unexpected ally in one of the new maids, Layla, who had been watching her with those understanding eyes. One afternoon, while cleaning Sarah's room, Layla whispered, "I know what you're trying to do. My sister went through something similar." From that moment, Layla became crucial to Sarah's plans, helping her gather documents and creating distractions when needed. But more importantly, she provided something Sarah had been missing for years: genuine human connection. The children, especially Adam, began to notice subtle changes in their mother. She started asking them more questions about their feelings, their dreams, their fears, always careful to do so when they weren't being monitored. "What would you like to be?" "When you grow up?" she asked Adam one day during their private reading time. Adam looked confused. "Father says I will run the company like him." "But what do you want?" Sarah pressed gently. Her son's face showed a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps longing before the practiced mask returned. "I want to make Father proud," he replied automatically. Malik, however, was more forthcoming. "I want to see snow," he declared during one of their secret English conversations, "and ride on an airplane and go to a real school like in your stories." Sarah's heart ached at his innocent wishes. She had nearly forgotten that normal children took such experiences for granted. One evening, as she was reviewing some of Adam's schoolwork, she noticed something troubling. His essays, while perfectly written in Arabic, showed no sign of original thought or creativity. Everything was a careful reproduction of the approved narratives his tutors had taught him. She began to pay closer attention to the children's education, documenting how the strict curriculum suppressed any form of independent thinking. Even their play was structured around lessons in proper behavior and family traditions. Mrs. Al-Rahman, one of the tutors, approached her one day. "I'm concerned about Malik's tendency to daydream. Perhaps we should increase his discipline training." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "He's only 4, she protested mildly. "The young master must learn his place in the family legacy," the tutor insisted. "Your husband has approved additional sessions." That night, Sarah called Amara with shaking hands. "They're talking about discipline training for my 4-year-old, she whispered. "How is this in his best interest?" "Document everything," Amara reminded her. "We're building a strong case, but we need to be thorough. International courts will want concrete evidence of how these restrictions affect the children's development." As weeks passed, Sarah noticed more signs of the psychological impact on her sons. Adam had started having nightmares but refused to discuss them, saying only that "Father says strong men don't complain." Malik had stopped singing entirely, even in private, after being scolded for humming during his lessons. She documented each incident, each small loss of childhood joy, building a detailed picture of the emotional prison her children were living in. But she also made sure to record moments of hope, times when their true personalities shone through the cracks in their conditioning, like the afternoon when Adam secretly helped Malik build a fort out of cushions away from the watchful eyes of their tutors, or the morning when Malik drew a picture of their family standing in snow, then quickly hid it when he heard footsteps approaching. Sarah was careful to maintain her appearance of perfect submission, playing the role of the dutiful wife and mother. She attended every social function on Karim's arm, smiled at all the right moments, and never questioned his decisions publicly. But inside, she was changing. Each piece of evidence she gathered, each secret conversation with Amara made her stronger. The woman who had once been overwhelmed by the gilded cage was slowly being replaced by someone more resilient, more determined. The turning point came During a family dinner when Karim announced his plans for Adam's future education, "I've arranged for him to begin intensive training with our business advisors," he declared. "At 7, he's ready to start learning how to manage his inheritance." Sarah watched her son's face carefully. For a brief moment, she saw fear flicker in his eyes before he assumed the expected expression of gratitude. That night, she added another entry to her growing documentation. Father implementing business training for 7-year-old, causing visible distress. As she ended her latest call with Amara, Sarah heard a small noise at her door. Her heart stopped. Had someone heard her? But when she opened it, she found only Malik's favorite stuffed animal lying in the hallway. Picking it up, she noticed a small tear in its side, as if it had been clutched too tightly by frightened hands. Sarah's carefully constructed plans began to unravel on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She was in the children's study room, supervising their lessons as usual, when she noticed Adam watching her with an intensity that reminded her too much of his father. "Mother," he said in careful Arabic, "why do you hide a phone in your room?" The question sent ice through her veins, but years of practice helped her maintain her composure. "What makes you think that, Habibi?" "I saw you," he replied, his voice wavering between accusation and confusion. "Last night when you thought I was sleeping, you were talking to someone in English." Before Sarah could respond, she noticed one of the tutors had paused in the doorway, obviously listening. "We'll discuss this later. Adam," she said firmly, switching to Arabic, "focus on your studies now." That evening, she found Layla waiting in her room, face pale with worry. The tutor reported the conversation to security, she whispered hurriedly while pretending to arrange flowers. "They're planning to search your room tonight." Sarah's mind raced. The phone contained months of documented evidence, conversations, photographs, notes. If they found it, everything would be lost. She needed to act quickly, but she couldn't risk raising suspicion by leaving her room at an unusual hour. "Mrs. Al-Rahman?" A guard's voice called from the hallway. "Your husband requests your presence in his study immediately." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Karim wasn't supposed to return from his business trip until tomorrow. She caught Layla's eye, and the maid gave her a barely perceptible nod. She would try to remove the phone while Sarah was gone. The walk to Karim's study felt like a journey to the executioner's chamber. Each step echoed against the marble floors, marking the possible end of everything she had worked for. When she entered, she found him standing at the window, his back to her. "Do you know what I love about you, Sarah?" he asked without turning around. "Your predictability. Like a beautiful bird in a cage, you've learned to sing such a lovely song of submission." He finally turned to face her, and the cold calculation in his eyes made her blood freeze. "So, imagine my surprise when I learned that my predictable little bird has been secretly flying around behind my back." "I don't understand," Sarah managed to say, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Karim smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No? Then perhaps you can explain why our son seems to think you're hiding something, or why one of our most trusted security guards reported unusual activities in your wing of the palace." He walked to his desk and pressed a button. A screen descended from the ceiling, displaying security footage of the palace gardens. Sarah watched in horror as grainy images showed her recent conversations with Layla, their lips moving in what was clearly more than servant-mistress interaction. "Your father always said Americans were too trusting," Karim continued, his voice dangerously soft. "He warned me that you might never fully understand our ways, but I defended you, assured him that you had adapted beautifully." He moved closer, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. The gesture, once loving, now felt threatening. "Tell me I haven't made a mistake in trusting you, Habibi." Sarah forced herself to lean into his touch, years of survival instincts kicking in. "Of course not, my love. Adam must have misunderstood what he saw. And Layla, she reminds me of my sister. Perhaps I've been too friendly with her." Your sister." Karim released her and returned to his desk. "It's interesting you should mention her. We received a request for you to visit your family. Your mother is apparently unwell." Sarah's heart leaped. This could be an opportunity, but one look at Karim's face told her it was another test. "Of course, I assume you'll decline," he continued smoothly. "After all, your place is here with our children, unless you had other thoughts." The trap was perfectly laid. If she showed too much interest in leaving, it would confirm his suspicions. If she appeared too indifferent to her mother's illness, it would seem unnatural. "Whatever you think is best," she replied carefully. "You know I trust your judgment in all things." Karim studied her face for a long moment. "Yes, you've become quite skilled at saying exactly what I want to hear, but I wonder." He pressed another button on his desk, and the door opened to reveal a security guard leading in a terrified-looking Layla. "Perhaps your confidant can help us understand the situation better." Sarah's mind raced. Had Layla managed to hide the phone? Had she been caught? Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw both fear and determination in the maid's expression. "Sir," Layla began, her voice trembling but clear, "I have served your family faithfully. If I have seemed too familiar with Mrs. Al-Rahman, it was only because She never finished her sentence. Another guard burst into the room, holding the hidden phone. Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis as Karim took the device, his face hardening as he examined it. "It seems," he said quietly, "that we have much to discuss." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos within the palace walls. Sarah found herself confined to her rooms, with doubled security outside her door. The familiar luxury of her suite now felt suffocating as she waited for Karim's next move. Through her windows, she watched Layla being escorted from the palace grounds carrying a small bag of belongings. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Sarah saw her friend mouth something that looked like "be strong," before being ushered into a waiting car. The children were kept away from her, a punishment that cut deeper than any physical confinement. Through the palace gossip network, which even increased security couldn't completely silence, she learned that Adam was distraught, blaming himself for what he'd inadvertently set in motion. Late that evening, Karim finally summoned her to his study again. The room felt different at night, the elaborate decorations casting strange shadows on the walls. He sat behind his desk, looking exhausted but controlled. "I've spent the day reviewing the contents of this phone," he began without preamble. "I must admit, you've been more resourceful than I expected. Documentation, photographs, recordings, quite the collection of evidence you've built against me and my family." Sarah remained silent, knowing anything she said could only make things worse. "The lawyer you've been speaking with," he continued, "is quite well known in international circles. She's built quite a reputation challenging cases like ours." He smiled thinly. "Of course, she's never won against someone with our resources, but I admire her persistence." He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "I've consulted with our family's advisors. They suggest two possible paths forward." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was the moment she had been dreading. "The first option is simple. We lock you away in our summer palace in the desert. No contact with the children, no outside communication, nothing. You'll live in comfort, but in complete isolation, until you learn to appreciate the privileges you've been given." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "The second option, well, that depends on your cooperation." "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A clean break," he replied. "You sign papers relinquishing all claims to the children, admit to having an affair, and return to America in disgrace. The children remain here, where they belong, and you never attempt to contact them again." Sarah felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. "And if I refuse both options?" Karim's smile was cold. "Then I release evidence of your unstable behavior to the press. Your documented conversations with imaginary allies, your paranoid recordings, your delusional claims of imprisonment in a palace where you live like a queen. Who would believe you're fit to mother any child after that? The children need their mother," Sarah protested, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The children need stability and proper guidance," Karim countered. "Adam is already showing signs of confusion because of your influence. Malik still clings to your Western ideas. This ends now." He placed a document on the desk between them. You have until morning to decide. Choose wisely, Habibi. Remember, you can leave with your dignity and the possibility of building a new life, or you can lose everything, including your freedom. Sarah stared at the paper, her mind racing. Years of documented evidence, carefully built plans, all undone in a single day. But perhaps not everything was lost. Amara had copies of everything, even if she couldn't use them immediately. May, I see my children, she asked quietly. Before I decide? Karim studied her for a moment before nodding. Supervised, of course, and only if you've made the right decision by morning. Back in her room, Sarah paced like a caged animal. The choice before her seemed impossible. Abandon her children or risk losing everything, including any chance of helping them in the future. As dawn approached, she remembered something Amara had told her during one of their first conversations. Sometimes to win the war, you have to lose a battle first. When the sun rose, Sarah had made her decision. She would sign the papers, but this wouldn't be the end. She would find another way to fight for her children, even if it took years. Better to be a free mother fighting from the outside than an imprisoned one with no power to help them at all. The meeting was set for noon in Karim's study. Before that, she was granted 1 hour with her children under the watchful eyes of security. When Adam and Malik ran into her arms, she held them. So tight they squirmed. "Why were you away, Mama?" Malik asked, his small face worried. "I've been unwell," she replied, carefully aware of their audience, "but I'm better now." Adam watched her with his father's calculating eyes, but she saw tears threatening to spill. "Are you going away?" he whispered in English, breaking protocol. Sarah's heart shattered, but she forced herself to smile. "Sometimes," she said, switching back to Arabic, "we have to be apart from the ones we love to protect them. But it doesn't mean we stop loving them. Remember that. Always." The flight back to America felt surreal. Sarah sat in first class, a final gift from Karim, watching clouds pass beneath the plane. In her hand, she clutched a small gold necklace Malik had pressed into her palm just before she left, a tiny act of defiance that gave her hope. Her arrival in New York made international headlines. Millionaire's wife leaves family in scandal. The story Karim's PR team crafted was perfect in its simplicity. A young American woman, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of her position, had chosen freedom over family. Photos of her shopping in luxury boutiques and attending parties years ago were circulated, painting a picture of a shallow socialite who had abandoned her children for a life of self-indulgence. Sarah's family, though devastated by the situation, stood by her. Her mother, who had indeed been ill but not critically so, welcomed her home with open arms and no questions. It was only late at night, when she heard Sarah crying in her old bedroom, that she began to understand the true depth of what had happened. "You didn't abandon them," her mother whispered, holding her daughter close. "You're fighting for them in the only way you can right now." Gradually, Sarah began to rebuild her life, but with a purpose that would have surprised those who believed the tabloid stories. She enrolled in law school, focusing on international family law. Her experiences in the palace had taught her the value of understanding legal systems and power structures. Every night, she wrote letters to her children that she couldn't send. She documented everything she remembered about their time together, their personalities, their dreams. These letters became her anchor, reminding her why she had to keep fighting. 6 months into her self-imposed exile, she received an unexpected message from Layla, who had relocated to London. Her former ally had managed to maintain contact with some of the palace staff and had news about the children. "Adam asks about you," Layla wrote. "He pretends not to, but the servants say he goes to your old garden spot every day. Malik keeps drawing pictures of snow and hiding them under his mattress. They haven't forgotten you, Sarah, they're waiting." The message gave her renewed strength. Working with Amara, who had never given up on her case, Sarah began building a new strategy. They couldn't fight Karim's influence head-on, but they could work to change the systems that gave him his power. Sarah's story, though twisted by the media, had struck a chord with other women in similar situations. She began receiving messages from around the world. stories of mothers separated from their children by wealth, power, and archaic laws. Each story reinforced her determination. 1 year after leaving the palace, Sarah gave her first public interview. She was careful not to directly challenge Karim or his family, instead speaking broadly about the need for international custody law reform. The interview went viral, catching the attention of human rights organizations and advocacy groups. "I'm not here to tell my story," she said when asked about her marriage. "I'm here to talk about all the other stories that never get told. About children caught between cultures, about families torn apart by laws that haven't kept pace with our global world." Her words reached the palace, where Adam, now 9, secretly watched the interview on a hidden tablet. He saw his mother, different from his memories but somehow stronger, speaking about justice and change. Though he had been taught to view her as selfish and unstable, something in her calm determination made him question the narrative he'd been fed. Malik, at 6, was less subtle in his reactions. He began asking direct questions about his mother, refusing to accept the simplified explanations he was given. "If Mama was bad," he challenged his tutors, "why do I remember her being good?" Their questions created ripples in the carefully controlled palace environment. Karim, frustrated by his son's continued attachment to their mother, increased their schedule of activities and lessons, trying to leave no time for doubts or questions. But Sarah's influence had planted seeds that couldn't be easily uprooted. Adam, explaining a business concept to his tutors, would sometimes slip into English without realizing it. Malik would hum forbidden lullabies while doing his homework. Small acts of rebellion that showed their mother's spirit lived on in them. Meanwhile, Sarah's advocacy work began gaining serious attention. Her law professors, impressed by her dedication and insight, connected her with international organizations working to reform custody laws. She traveled to conferences, spoke at universities, and worked tirelessly to build a network of allies and supporters. One evening, as she prepared for a major speech at the United Nations, Sarah received another message from Layla. This one contained a photograph taken secretly by one of the palace staff, Adam and Malik sitting in the garden, building a small snowman out of white stones. 3 years after leaving the palace, Sarah stood before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The case she had helped build wasn't just about her children anymore. It had become a landmark battle for parental rights across cultures. Dozens of similar cases had been consolidated into one groundbreaking hearing that could change international family law forever. As she presented evidence of systematic parent-child separation in cross-cultural marriages, Sarah's voice never wavered. The documentation she had gathered years ago in the palace, combined with hundreds of other cases, painted a compelling picture of a system that needed reform. Back in the palace, Adam, now 10, sat in his father's study, watching the proceedings on an international news channel. Karim had allowed it, confident that the court would rule in his favor as all others had before. But something had changed in the years since his mother's departure. "Father," Adam said carefully, "why can't we hear her side of the story?" Karim looked at his son sharply. "We've discussed this, Adam. Your mother made her choice." "Did she?" Adam's voice was quiet but firm. "Or did we make it for her?" In his room, Malik had created a secret shrine to his mother, drawings, a few old photographs, and the matching necklace to the one she had taken with her. At 7, he was too young to fully understand the legal proceedings, but he understood loss and love. The court's deliberations lasted weeks. Sarah spent the time working with other parents in similar situations, sharing stories and building support networks. Her law degree was nearly complete, and she had already helped several families navigate the complex web of international custody laws. Then, on a bright spring morning, the court delivered its historic ruling. While they couldn't overrule individual countries' laws entirely, they established new guidelines for cross-cultural custody cases. Parents would have guaranteed visitation rights regardless of cultural differences. Children's voices would have to be considered in custody decisions. Most importantly, using wealth and influence to completely cut off a parent's access to their children was declared a violation of human rights. The ruling sent shockwaves through traditional power structures. Karim's lawyers advised him that fighting the new regulations would bring unwanted scrutiny to his business empire. His mother, ever practical, suggested a compromise might be wise. "Times are changing," she told him. "Perhaps we should change with them." The first meeting was arranged in neutral territory, a family counseling center in Geneva. Sarah's heart raced as she waited in the comfortable meeting room. When the door opened and her children walked in, she barely recognized them. Adam, tall and serious like his father, hesitated for a moment before emotion cracked his careful facade. Malik simply ran to her, 7 years of longing breaking through years of conditioning. As she held them both, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "I kept all your letters," Adam whispered in English, his accent perfect despite the years of separation. "The ones you couldn't send. Father found them in your room after you left. I've read them all." "And I kept drawing snow," Malik added, pulling out a folded paper from his pocket. "Just like you taught us." The reunion wasn't perfect. Years of separation and competing narratives had left their marks. Adam struggled between his love for both parents, while Malik had questions that couldn't be easily answered. But it was a beginning. Under the new court guidelines, Sarah was granted regular visitation rights. She would be allowed to spend holidays with her children, to attend their school events, to be part of their lives again. It wasn't the complete custody she had once dreamed of, but it was something real and lasting. Karim, faced with the choice between continued conflict and a workable peace, chose the latter. Their interactions remained formal but civil, focused on their children's well-being. The palace walls that had once imprisoned Sarah now opened regularly to allow her visits. On her first Christmas with the children, Sarah took them to see real snow. Standing in a Swiss mountain resort, watching Malik attempt his first snowman while Adam pretended not to be excited, she felt a circle closing. The dream of freedom she had once thought would cost her everything had instead given her something new. Not a fairy tale ending, but a real one, built on courage, perseverance, and an unwavering mother's love. As the sun set over the snowy peaks, Adam approached her with a serious expression. "Mother," he said, "I understand now why you had to leave. And I want you to know I'm proud of what you did, not just for us, but for all the other families too." Malik, face flushed with cold and happiness, added, "Can you teach me the snow song again? The one you used to sing in English?" Sarah gathered her children close, their breath making clouds in the crisp mountain air. The song came back easily, as if she had never stopped singing it. As their voices joined hers, she knew that while their story wasn't over, its hardest chapters were behind them. The fairy tale palace had turned out to be a prison, but the reality they had built to replace it was something far more precious. A family bound not by walls and rules, but by love, understanding, and the freedom to be themselves. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah's journey of courage and maternal love has touched your hearts. Her story reminds us that true love sometimes means fighting for what's right, even when the path seems impossible. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. We bring you powerful stories of resilience and hope every day. Join our community in the comments below and share your thoughts on this emotional journey. Remember, every great story deserves to be heard, and we have many more waiting for you in our special playlist. Just click the link to your left. Until our next story, keep believing in the power of love and determination.